Greetings to Politics Aside. Welcome. We appreciate you joining us today on our inaugural series of speaker series of Politics Aside. And, we're asked periodically, what does that mean, politics aside? Well, as you know, all of us are involved in politics. I don't care whether it's at school or at work or on Capitol Hill, where we're just about 1,000 feet from the US Capitol today as we have our conversation. But we're also asked a lot of questions. We're a political business and consulting firm here in Washington, D.C., and we're asked daily about many topics, from what's happening around the world to what's happening in the U.S. to what may be happening in Des Moines, Iowa. And what we decided to do is start a series called Politics Aside, where we'll have an opportunity to talk with possible partisans on a particular issue. We like to hear all sides of an issue, and we may hear from a neutral position when it comes to issues that are impacting all of you. Now, we do encourage that you send us a note if there's some topics that you would like us to talk about. We'd appreciate being able to follow through, because we really do want to talk about issues that are top of mind. And, case in point, there's going to be some rapid response issues, such as we're going to talk about today, what's happening in the Ukraine. But we're also looking at having the series over a number of topics that are impacting folks around the world, and certainly here in the US, and possibly even on Capitol Hill, which I said we're just steps away from the US Capitol. Again, we're a bipartisan firm. And we try our best to hang out with people that have a lot of information that we can provide and make available to our friends and our clients. So Politics Aside was developed as a way to provide just thoughtful dialogue, conversation on issues, as I mentioned, that are top of mind. Some will be certainly rapid response, but again, we're looking at the future of issues. Hopefully we can cut through some of the noise. There's not a day that goes by, whether it's with friends or in business, where we're collecting all this information all the time. It's like this news media is saying this and this one's saying that. And I think that there comes a time for what I think is very thoughtful conversation with experts. And again, we're excited to have you join us today for our inaugural version. We have a good friend of mine with us today that I've known for, I think, almost 20 years, Patrick Costello, who is a known expert in the world of foreign affairs and politics. He's CEO of the American Security Project. So Patrick, let's get started. I know the clock is ticking for everybody on the call, plus your time. Let's face it, we've got 1,000 some Russian troops that are on the border of Ukraine. We have a lot of rhetoric between politicians, and of course it's campaign season, so politicians around the world are all taking a position. Are we really on the brink of war, or what do you think, Patrick? Can you tell us how we got here and where we are and where we're going?
Yeah, John, well, first, thank you very much for having me. I applaud your efforts with this new podcast virtual meeting format. I should note for the audience that in addition to being a longtime friend of John's, John gave me my start in Washington. I served in his congressional office in a variety of different roles, including advising him on foreign policy. So let's get to that. Putting all the rhetoric aside, I think let's be very, very clear that this crisis has been manufactured by Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. Russian troops, artillery, armored vehicles, tanks, and other equipment currently encircle Ukraine. They are along the Russian border with Ukraine. They are in the annexed territory of Crimea, as well as in Belarus, which is to Ukraine's north, threatening a major military confrontation. President Biden has said that the United States and our allies were looking to ward off, quote, the most consequential thing that's happened in the world in terms of war and peace since World War II. Just let that sink in. So Russia's latest preparation for what now seems like a major large-scale invasion of Ukraine was in part sparked by current Ukrainian government inviting America and NATO forces to conduct joint exercises and engage in other military cooperation to boost Ukraine's defense capabilities against further Russian aggression. But let's talk about how we got here. So there's a conflict in eastern Ukraine that's transitioned to a stalemate after it first erupted in 2014. You had the annexation of Crimea in 2014, in the winter of 2014. In eastern Ukraine, still a conflict. There's shelling, there's skirmishes regularly. There was an escalation in violence in the spring of last year. But the massing and Russia massed troops and hardware along its border with Ukraine in April of last year. So let's take that as the first page of the current chapter. So in April of last year, it brought back memories of the incursion in 14-15 and raised fears of another round of Russian aggression. And again, 100,000 plus troops amassed along the border. Those troops went home. And the Russian Defense Ministry said that those were just exercises along our border in Russian territory, but they left materiel and infrastructure behind. Now, in October of last year, Russia began moving more troops and military equipment to the border of Ukraine, reigniting concerns over a possible invasion. Commercial satellite imagery and social media posts from November and December of last year showed armor, missiles, other heavy equipment moving towards Ukraine with no official explanation. By December, there was more than 100,000 troops in place. And that's when US intelligence officials and other Western intelligence services began warning that Russia may be planning an invasion in early 2022. In mid-December of last year, the Russian Foreign Ministry also issued a set of demands, which included a ban on Ukraine entering NATO, a reduction of US troops and military equipment in Eastern Europe in order for its military forces to be withdrawn. The United States and NATO allies rejected these demands and have warned Russia of retaliation if Ukraine is invaded, including economic sanctions, and other assistance has been deployed to Ukraine. We can get into that. But I do think I'd be remiss if we didn't talk a bit about Putin's ambitions. And I take Putin at his word. And by that, I mean reflecting on a very consequential and quite troubling essay that he penned in the summer entitled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." And he's outlined a historical basis for his claims against Ukraine, that Russia and Ukraine were one of the same people, blaming the current collapse on bilateral ties on foreign plots and anti-Russian conspiracies, saying that Russia was robbed of this territory. And he ends his treatise appearing to suggest to the Ukrainian people that Ukrainian statehood itself ultimately depends on Moscow's consent, declaring, quote, "I'm confident that the true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia." Now that's—
So Patrick, if I may,
Yeah,
just
sorry.
to expand upon that. So, one of my questions was going to be, well, why now? And I think you're laying out that case, right?
Well, there's a couple of different reasons for why now. I think part of it is that Putin sees an opportunity. He signaled with this essay. There has been a constant state of conflict in Ukraine. But I'd also like to reflect on the words of Fiona Hill, who wrote recently that from Russia's perspective, the United States is grievously weakened at home and abroad. Putin sees America's political disarray, the president's difficulties in achieving his domestic agenda, combined with China's rise at the expense of the United States. And they seem to mirror Russia's predicament immediately after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And so he sees this as a unique time in history to correct the wrongs of the past. And by that, I mean his view that the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union, of which Ukraine was a key part.
So that would fit into what appears to be his master plan. Why in February of 22? Is there reasons why? Is it environmental as well as political? Why today?
Well, it's been 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia has its own internal domestic challenges, so it could be a game to rally the Russian people around the flag. Or it could just be he sees this as a unique opportunity to get concessions either out of Kiev or out of Washington, or out of Brussels. It's hard to read into his mind, but I think that, again, reflecting back on that essay, his intention is clear.
So if you're plotting in your Putin, are you thinking it's winter and now's the time because of the environment, or as you're amassing 100, whatever that number is? I've heard, again, bless our news information, from 100,000 to 200,000, wherever that is. I mean, that's a massive undertaking. And now, is it because of the time of year to really move forward on something like this?
Well, that's part of it. I mean, even though we're in the 21st century, the same types of conditions that war strategists need to take into consideration are the same as they were in the 20th century and 19th century, and even further back. And I was thinking about this issue. I was reflecting back on ages ago when I was studying war studies at King's College London, and I reflected on The Art of War by Sun Tzu, where he says you need to know yourself, know your enemy, know the terrain, and know the weather. And the latter of which kind of demonstrates why now might be the time when you're looking at heavily armed tanks and armored personnel carriers, when you're looking at moving troops along, moving infantry along not insignificant distances. You need hard, cold ground. And you're not going to get that in the spring in Eastern Europe. You're going to get that in the winter in Eastern Europe. So the weather actually and geography is a determining factor here.
And we hear different stories about troop movement, of course, and where they're located. And it appears like a lot of that focuses on the eastern border. What about the balance of Ukraine? What are the other weak links?
Yeah, so I'm glad you bring this up because it's important. There is an ongoing insurgency in eastern Ukraine. That's where a lot of the attention is, but I'd like to talk a bit about Belarus, which is to Ukraine's north. There's upwards of 30,000 troops, Russian troops in Belarus. If you look at the map, again, geography is a determining factor in conflict. The Kiev, capital of Ukraine, is not that far from the Belarusian border. It is quite far from Donetsk, Donbass, on the Luhansk, on the eastern side of Ukraine. So if you were going to make a move on the capital, it would be best to come through the north, and that's coming through Belarus. And I was struck while I was thinking about this question a bit and just going through some overseas reporting that there was a letter coming out of the European Parliament signed by a number of members of the European Parliament looking at the recent deployment of Russian troops to Belarus and the threat that it poses in Ukraine. And they said it was signed by 77 MEPs from across the political spectrum, from across Europe, Denmark, France, Germany, Sweden, Spain. And their contention was that Russia has de facto occupied its neighbor Belarus while the world's attention is focused on Ukraine, and that might be part of the broader strategic war planning that Putin has by looking at that northern access route towards the capital.
So I'm going to come back to more of the internal challenges for the families in Ukraine here in a moment. But let's now go beyond just the border. Let's talk a little bit about how does China fit into this? How does the rest of the world fit into this? And what are the plans? What do you think Germany's going to do? China's going to do? And I know you mentioned in your opening about the opportunity based upon the appearance that we may not be as strong, if I interpreted you correctly. What does this mean to China? So could you share with us some of connect those dots for us as well, please?
Yeah, how China is viewing this is an interesting question. Let me just play out a scenario. A world power hosts the Olympic Games and immediately afterwards seizes territory it views as its own historical property. Like, that's exactly what happened in 2014 in the Winter Olympics in Sochi. Beijing is watching this closely. Beijing's hosting the Winter Olympics. How the world responds to this current crisis along Ukraine's frontier will condition how China thinks about maybe a contingency with Taiwan. So I think that's important signaling. Now, the politics within NATO, within the transatlantic relationship, is also really interesting. Obviously, there's been a lot of diplomacy over the recent months. Secretary Blinken has been traveling around Brussels and consulting with NATO allies constantly. He's also been consulting with the Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. President Biden has had calls with European leaders and with President Zelensky. Actually, the Polish foreign minister is going to be here in Washington starting today. So that just shows you kind of the constant coordination and consultation that's going on. But there needs to be alliance unity within NATO. NATO is a consensus-driven organization, and you're seeing like solid rhetoric. We're also, moving U.S. additional troops into the European theater. The president announced this week movement of about 3,000 troops into different points in Europe. We announced we were placing another 8,500 troops on heightened alert. But yeah, the politics within Europe is really, really interesting right now. You've got Emmanuel Macron of France having various diplomatic initiatives. That's kind of an interesting space to watch as he tries to be the big man in Europe. He's trying to coordinate behind the scenes consultations between Ukrainian and Russian leaders to try and tamp down tensions, try and come to some resolution. So it's quite interesting to watch what's going on in various European capitals, in Brussels, and with the broader coordination across the NATO alliance.
So on Germany then specifically, with the pipeline, although it's constructed, it has not been authorized for use yet, correct? Isn't that a big piece of this as well? Where is Germany playing right now?
Yeah, that is correct. As we all know, Angela Merkel is no longer chancellor. There's some interesting coalition politics going on in Germany. There is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which has been constructed. There are regulatory considerations within Germany, so it hasn't really come online. But I know that inside NATO headquarters in Brussels, senior officials gathered recently to think about what would happen to Europe if Russia were to slow the flow of natural gas. And so that's a consideration there. Germany's a key part of that. I think Europe as a whole buys about 40% of its gas that it consumes from Gazprom, the Russian state oil giant. So if there's a military conflict in Ukraine and gas is turned into a weapon of that conflict. So Russian gas is flowing into Europe, quite freely and regularly. And so they're concerned about that. But yeah, Germany's an interesting place to watch. You no longer have Chancellor Merkel at the helm. You have a rather untested chancellor who's got to manage his own internal coalition politics. But then there's also kind of where does Germany fit into Europe as a whole question that's also floating out there.
So has Germany taken a position yet? Have they taken a diplomatic position, or are they wait and see, or what's Germany doing?
Rhetorically, they're aligned with what we're saying. NATO is pretty much in lockstep rhetorically on pushing back against the threat of Russian aggression and saying we will provide Ukraine with the support it needs, lethal assistance it needs, training it needs. So there's been alignment and consistency there.
So speaking of alignment, in this town that we both spend a lot of time in, Capitol Hill, and with the administration, and as I mentioned earlier, we're now moving into campaign season. We have serious challenges facing the country. The question of what's going to happen with the Supreme Court, what's going to happen with inflation, what's going to happen, and there certainly is a fatigue from people I talk to about all of the rhetoric. So let's talk about Ukraine, and specifically for the moment, what do you see seriously happening on Capitol Hill, and what can the House and Senate do? I understand we're looking at sanctions. and there's a difference of opinion whether it should be pre-sanctioned or post-sanctions, right? So tell me about what's happening here across the street.
Right. And it is indeed just directly across the street from where you sit, Congressman. So up on the Hill, divide this into two different things. There's been a lot of congressional travel to Ukraine in recent weeks. There was a CODEL led by Senator Shaheen and Senator Portman, with about a half a dozen other senators along for the ride that went to Kiev to meet with leaders there. And then there was also a CODEL that was hosted by or organized by House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Greg Meeks with his House colleagues. So there's been a lot of visibility by members of Congress in Ukraine. That's to, one, rhetorically bolster President Zelensky, and two, to really just show that we are in there supporting as our presence demonstrates. On the policy side, there is a Russian sanctions bill that's currently up in the air. A bipartisan Senate group is cobbling together a comprehensive Russia sanctions bill. It seems like they're pretty close to an agreement according to reporting, but they remain kind of hung up on two different provisions. So according to Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Menendez, they're still going back and forth over Nord Stream 2 sanctions, as well as specific penalties that might be imposed before a Russian invasion. And I actually don't like the term that they use, before a Russian invasion, because Russia's already invaded, they're already occupying, they've already seized territory. So I think that they need to kind of check their language a bit there, because words have meaning. But there's both the pre-invasion sanctions and Nord Stream 2 associated sanctions. Those are priorities of the Republican side, and there's indications that Democrats are going to acquiesce and they'll get to some deal. I guess it's unclear where the Biden administration comes down. Chairman Menendez has acknowledged that the White House is quote not enthralled with the pre-invasion sanctions, but he suggested that if there's a strong bipartisan response, then that strengthens the administration's hand to diplomacy. So Menendez and Risch, his counterpart on the other side of the aisle on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, they think that they're optimistic that they'll get a package across the finish line. Another interesting aspect to the legislation that's currently under consideration and currently under draft, it's likely to include a bipartisan provision to set up a lend-lease program for Ukraine. If that term rings a historical bell, it's because that was a program we had with the British during World War II. Senator Cornyn, who's really pushing this measure, says that it's not controversial amongst the group of 8 senators who are cobbling together this legislation, and that the program would allow the US to send weapons and other supplies to Ukraine with the promise of repayment later. Again, that's what we did with the Brits in World War II. Now, this is something that could move quite quickly on the Hill, where things usually don't move quite quickly. It's a rare signal of bipartisan agreement and compromise, and I do think that the strong signaling from the Hill would strengthen the administration's hand as they continue to embark on a diplomatic course.
So assume something does pass on Capitol Hill, does it have teeth? How is it enforced? Something from the political side?
Yeah, that's a great question. Depends upon the elasticity within the legislation, types of waiver authorities that are granted to the administration. So that's the devil, as you know, having written laws yourself and having served on Capitol Hill for quite some time, and now working in the shadow of the Capitol. The devil's in the details. So that's all stuff that they're working out at the staff level right now. But I would expect a robust package that doesn't really tie the administration's hands, but gives them some flexibility so that they can continue down this diplomatic track. But that gives Secretary Blinken the ability to say, hey, look, I need you to meet me here, Lavrov, because I've got these hawks on the Hill who are really going to make this quite painful for you.
So, Patrick, I know technically have a few moments left, but I still want to ask you a few questions, if
Of
you don't
course.
mind. And I think that our friends and colleagues from around the country will probably have their own questions at some point to send in. But we talked a little bit about this earlier, and that is what tools does the president have, and what tools does he still have to use, and what tools has he used so far?
Well, one thing that the president has done, and we've backed this up, been backed up by NATO allies, is moving troops into Eastern Europe. As I said, there's approximately 3,000 troops moving there now. John Kirby announced that earlier this week. There's the provision of lethal assistance to the Ukrainian military, anti-tank missiles, different military kit. There's also trainers American military trainers who are in Ukraine training the Ukrainian military. So those are kind of the main offensive tools at his disposal at the moment. But I think we all have to recognize that the ball really is in Vladimir Putin's court, because that's really what we can do. Otherwise we're in a bit of a reactive posture here.
Is he traditionally reactive to the threats of sanctions?
No.
I know not to ask a question unless I know the answer. I was anticipating you saying that, because he doesn't really care.
Sanctions are a foreign policy tool to try and condition and change the target of the sanctions behavior, right? We sanctioned Vladimir Putin for his malign Russian entities for their malign activities in interfering with the 2016 election. They're still conducting active measures, malign activities, cyber warfare. We sanctioned, and our Western allies sanctioned Russia in response to the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Eastern Ukraine in 2014. They still hold Crimea. They still fuel an insurgency and back insurgents in Eastern Ukraine. He's not changing his behavior because of sanctions. So that's why I think you kind of need to get creative and make it really hurt him and the people around him. And that's basically personalizing those sanctions, making that scalpel really, really sharp and really, really targeted. Visa bans, not allowing the children of the oligarchs to go to Harvard and Columbia, and having our European allies also in lockstep saying, you know what, your kids can't go to Oxford or the Sorbonne. Do that. That will be a painful thing for those individuals surrounding Vladimir Putin.
So let's talk just for a moment about what a win looks like for him. So there are lots of wins. There's intimidation, there's authority and strength by intimidation. There's puppet governments. There's lots of ways that he could win, correct?
Yeah, there could be a puppet government installed in Ukraine, and that would basically allow him to control the Ukrainian polity without having to control the Ukrainian territory. So yeah, that would be a win for him, certainly. I also don't put off the prospects of invasion and him just taking the territory by force. One of the things that we had discussed before is if he did gain control of the Ukrainian polity with a puppet government in Kyiv, then controlling the Ukrainian people is a matter of having an authoritarian police state. What would be our response to that? If we are not willing to intervene in the face of 130,000 troops on the border, then if there's an authoritarian regime installed, what would be the response from the West outside of harsh rhetoric? And harsh rhetoric only goes so far.
As you know, the time is running short, but I like to bring it really close to home. And that is, when I'm asked, what does this have to do with $4 or $5 a gallon gas, and what does this mean for the cost of milk and groceries? And I have trouble getting groceries, and most people are worried about taking care of their kids, getting to work, paying their bills, finding a place to live. How does this impact with the day-to-day life here in the States or around the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as a foreign policy geek, I sometimes have difficulty explaining to non-foreign policy geeks why this stuff matters. One, I would reflect back on President Biden's words that this is basically one of the most consequential events in Europe, potentially since World War II. So that is in and of itself a matter that should be of concern for every American. The other is gas. There's war, gas prices will go up. So that's going to hit our pocketbooks. And the other is market reaction. Markets don't like instability. A war in Ukraine would create instability. Markets will react. Those latter 2 points, I think, are things that would affect the broader American people. And then it's a matter of national standing. I mean, if we don't stand up to bullies in the schoolyard, we as Americans don't stand up to bullies in the schoolyard, who is?
Well, I think that's a great way to conclude, Patrick, and appreciate your wisdom and your guidance for so many years, and certainly our friendship. I think it's a real credit to you, and we appreciate you being with the American Security Project as its CEO. We look forward to ongoing conversations. And as mentioned earlier, we want to create this forum for conversations about issues that are near to the hearts and souls of people around the country, if not around the world, and have a candid conversation. And yes, everything we do is politics. Yes, everything happens in politics. Our goal is to make sure we're aware of that, point out where this may well be political or it may not, find a neutral ground and really put politics aside. So we encourage all of you that tuned in today. We appreciate your time, but we do encourage you send us your ideas and suggestions. And as I mentioned, our goal is to put politics aside. So please be safe, and we look forward to talking to you very soon in the near future. Patrick, all the best. Great job.
Thank you.